The expensive French perfume in the ballroom was thick enough to choke a person, but it couldn't mask the rot coming from the woman in the white silk dress. I was standing less than 10 feet away when I heard her say it. Sloan Whitmore, the woman currently wearing a 3-carat diamond provided by my brother's mediocre salary, leaned in toward her bridesmaids with a smirk that belonged on a predator. Her voice didn't just carry, it cut through the air, specifically designed to land right in my lap. Oh, look, the stinky country girl actually crawled out of the barn to join us. The giggles that followed sounded like shards of glass hitting the marble floor. Sloan didn't even glance my way. To her, I wasn't a person. I was a smudge on the lens of her perfect, curated life. She assumed I was just some embarrassing relative who had hitchhiked from a dusty town to ruin the aesthetic of her high society engagement party. What Sloan didn't realize, what nobody in that glittering, self-absorbed room realized, was that I had signed the deed to this hotel exactly 3 years ago. The Monarch Hotel wasn't just a venue, it was my flagship. Every single chandelier hanging over her head, every fork she used to pick at her expensive salad, and every square inch of the Italian marble she was currently standing on belonged to me. By the time the sun came up, that one whisper was going to cost her every dream she had ever hallucinated. Have you ever been the most powerful person in a room while everyone else treated you like the help? It's a strange, intoxicating kind of silence. My name is Bethany Burns. I'm 31 years old, and I spent the first 18 years of my life in Millbrook, Pennsylvania. If you've never been there, picture a place where the local news consists of who won the pie baking contest, and the only traffic jam involves a herd of escaped cattle. I left the day I turned 18 with $200 and a suitcase held together by duct tape and sheer spite. I didn't leave because I hated the trees or the quiet. I left because my family had spent 18 years making sure I knew there was no room for me at the table. My older brother, Garrett, was the sun around which my parents' entire universe revolved. He was the golden child, the masterpiece, the one who could do no wrong. If I brought home an A, Garrett had already brought home a trophy. If I made the team, he was already the captain. My mother, Patricia, looked at me like I was a rough draft she had accidentally published, while Garrett was the final, leather-bound edition. So I walked away. I took a bus to the city and started at the very bottom, scrubbing toilets in a boutique hotel for minimum wage. I spent 2 years eating instant noodles in a room that didn't have a window, but I was learning. I watched how the rich spoke. I studied how the managers handled crises. I worked my way from housekeeping to the front desk, then to management, and eventually, I started buying. By 28, I owned my first property. By 31, I was the CEO of Birch Hospitality, owning 6 of the most exclusive boutique hotels on the East Coast. But I never told them. They never cared enough to ask what I did for a living, so I let them believe I was still struggling. It's funny how people only see what they expect to see. Tonight was supposed to be a celebration of Garrett's future, but the irony was so thick I could have choked on it. I'd received the invitation at the last minute, a clear guilt move from my mother so she could pretend we were a united front. I almost stayed home, but something, maybe instinct, maybe just a final shred of hope, made me drive through Millbrook and show up here. I walked into the Monarch, wearing my favorite boots and a pair of jeans that cost more than Sloane's bridesmaids' dresses. Though they'd never know it, real wealth doesn't need to scream. It whispers. And right now, the silence between me and my family was deafening. I saw my mother across the room, holding court like she was royalty, bragging about Garrett's refined new fiancé. Garrett stood next to Sloane, looking like he'd won the lottery, unaware he was holding a ticket for a drawing that had already been canceled. Sloane's eyes finally met mine, and the look of pure, unadulterated disgust she gave me was almost impressive. She didn't recognize me as a threat. She saw me as a stain. But I've learned that the most effective revenge isn't loud. It's a slow burn. It's watching someone dig their own grave while they're too busy laughing at the dirt on your shoes to realize you're the one holding the shovel. I walked to the bar and ordered a drink. catching the eye of Wesley Crane, my general manager. He gave me a tiny professional nod, his way of acknowledging the queen in her own castle without blowing my cover. Everything was running like clockwork. But within 3 hours, Sloan Whitmore was going to find out that you should never underestimate the girl who grew up shoveling hay, because she knows exactly how to handle a pile of manure when she sees it. Before we get into the moment the floor dropped out from under her, I have to ask, have you ever had someone take credit for your hard work while looking down their nose at you? If you've ever been the secret architect of your own success, while the world called you a failure, drop a comment below and tell me where you're watching from. I read every single one of them because I know what it's like to be the underdog. Now, let's get back to the night the Whitmores realized they'd picked the wrong family to scam. The party was a masterclass in overcompensation. There were ice sculptures of swans that looked like they were screaming for help, a champagne fountain that was bordering on a health code violation, and enough lilies to fill a funeral home. Sloan had clearly spent a fortune of money she didn't have to impress people she didn't like. I found a corner and just watched the theater of it all. That's when my mother found me. Patricia approached me like she was walking through a swamp, her eyes fixated on my boots with a look of genuine physical pain. She didn't ask how I was. She asked why I couldn't have worn something appropriate. She used the word refined about 6 times in 2 minutes, as if she were trying to cast a spell to turn me into a debutante. I told her I'd come straight from a meeting, which was true. I'd just closed a $12 million acquisition. But she just sighed that disappointed sigh that had been the soundtrack to my childhood. She told me to try not to embarrass Garrett in front of the Whitmores, then drifted away to find people who actually mattered to her. It took less than 30 seconds for her to make me feel like I was 12 years old and failing a test I hadn't studied for. I watched Sloan air kiss her way through the crowd, a professional politician in a cocktail dress. Her parents, Franklin and Delilah, stood nearby like peacocks. Franklin had the kind of boisterous, red-faced confidence you only see in 2 types of people: the truly successful and the truly desperate. Delilah was a walking jewelry store, dripping in diamonds that caught the light every time she took a sip of her drink. They looked like the picture of old money elegance, but there was something off about the way they held themselves. It was like a high-end painting that was hung just a few inches crooked. I couldn't quite name the feeling yet, but my gut was screaming. Garrett finally wandered over, looking at me with that patronizing big brother smile. He asked if I'd met Sloan yet, calling her the best thing that ever happened to this family. I kept my mouth shut, but then he dropped the bomb that changed everything. He mentioned that Mom had given Sloan Grandma's necklace as an engagement gift. The world stopped spinning for a second. That necklace wasn't just jewelry, it was a promise. My grandmother had held my hand on her deathbed and told me the antique gold pendant was mine because I was the dreamer of the family. My mother was in the room when she said it. She knew what that piece of history meant to me. And yet, there it was, hanging around Sloan's neck, sparkling under my chandeliers like a trophy of my mother's betrayal. The anger that flared up in my chest was unlike anything I'd felt before. It wasn't just about the gold. It was about the fact that they were literally giving away my identity to a stranger who thought I was stinky. I excused myself before I said something I couldn't take back and headed toward the restroom to splash some cold water on my face. On the way, I passed Franklin Whitmore in a secluded hallway. He was on his phone, his face tight with a stress that no amount of scotch could drown out. He didn't see me. He was too busy telling someone on the other end that the wedding had to happen, and that the Burns family had enough capital to cover the shortfall. He said they just had to get through the vows, and then everything would be fine. I stood frozen in the shadows, my anger over the necklace suddenly replaced by a cold, sharp clarity. The Burns family had money. My parents had a decent house with a second mortgage I had been secretly paying off for 4 years. Garrett made $60,000 a year at an insurance firm. There was no family fortune. So why did Franklin Whitmore think we were the golden ticket? And then the pieces started clicking together like a puzzle I didn't want to solve. For years, I had been sending money to my parents anonymously through Birch Hospitality. I didn't want the gratitude, I just wanted them to be safe. But my mother, in her infinite capacity to overlook me, must have assumed the money was coming from Garrett. She must have spent the last few years bragging to everyone that her golden boy was a secret millionaire, a financial genius who was taking care of his parents. The irony was a bitter pill. I was the one providing the bait that the Whitmores were currently trying to swallow. They were sharks, but they were swimming into a swimming pool, thinking it was the ocean. I found Wesley near the kitchens, his clipboard in hand. I didn't waste time. I told him I needed a deep dive on the Whitmores. Now, I wanted business filings, credit reports, and any lawsuits that hadn't hit the front page yet. Wesley nodded, not asking a single question, and disappeared into his office. While I waited, I went back to the ballroom, feeling like I was walking through a minefield. I watched the Whitmores with new eyes. Franklin was checking his phone every 90 seconds. Delilah kept touching her necklace with a nervous tick. And Sloan had a hunger in her eyes that had nothing to do with love. She was looking at Garrett like he was a life raft, not a husband. It became clear. The Whitmores were a house of cards, and a stiff breeze was about to blow through the Monarch. Sloan cornered me near the bar 20 minutes later. She made sure we were out of earshot of the guests before her sweet bride mask fell off, revealing the jagged edges underneath. She told me she knew I was pathetic, sending money home to try and buy a seat at a table that didn't want me. She said Garrett had told her everything. How I was the jealous little sister, the failure who couldn't handle his success. She leaned in close, her breath smelling of expensive wine and malice, and told me that once she was officially a Burns, she'd make sure I was permanently erased from the guest list. She called me dead weight. I just looked at her, marveling at the audacity. How do you tell someone they're bragging about a car they don't realize is about to be repossessed? Loneliness makes dangerous choices feel reasonable, I thought. But I didn't say it. I just let her walk away, her silk train sweeping across my floor. Wesley reappeared at my side 5 minutes later, his face pale. He handed me a folder and whispered, "It's worse than we thought." I stepped into the hallway to read it. The Whitmores weren't just in debt. They were the architects of a massive real estate Ponzi scheme. They were being investigated by the feds in 3 different states. Franklin had been shuffling money between shell companies for a decade, and the music was about to stop. This wedding wasn't a union. It was a getaway car. They thought they were marrying into a fortune that didn't exist. And if I didn't stop it, they were going to drain my parents' actual assets and Garrett's future before disappearing into the night. Part of me, the hurt 12-year-old part, wanted to let them all burn. Let my mother realize her golden son was a fraud, and let Garrett realize his dream girl was a predator. But I couldn't. Despite the years of silence and the stolen necklace, they were still my blood. You can't just watch your family walk off a cliff, even if they're the ones who pushed you toward the edge first. I called my lawyer, Rebecca, and a forensic accountant I've used for years, Naomi. Within 40 minutes, they had the smoking gun. The woman standing in my ballroom wasn't Sloan Whitmore. Her real name was Sandra Williams. She had a rap sheet in Arizona for similar scams. The parents weren't even her parents. They were her partners in a decade-long con. My phone buzzed with a text from Garrett. "Where are you? Something feels weird. Franklin is acting like a lunatic." I looked at the message for a long time. It was the first time he'd reached out to me for help in 10 years. It was too late to save the party, but it wasn't too late to save the family. I walked back into the ballroom, just as Franklin was stepping onto the stage for his big welcome toast. The room went quiet, the clink of silverware fading as he grabbed the microphone. He looked out at the crowd with that fake, practiced warmth, talking about legacy and the joining of 2 great fortunes. It was stomach-turning. I caught Wesley's eye and gave him the signal. Now, the massive digital screens behind the stage, which had been showing a slideshow of the happy couple, suddenly flickered. A court document from the state of Arizona appeared, blown up for everyone to see. Investigation into Sandra Williams, aka Sloan Whitmore. The murmur that went through the room sounded like a swarm of bees. Franklin's face went from a celebratory red to a ghostly white in 3 seconds. He tried to keep talking, stumbling over his words. But the screen changed again. This time, it was a list of bank accounts and shell companies, followed by a very clear photo of Sloan, or Sandra, from a mugshot 3 years prior. The silence that followed was absolute. You could have heard a pin drop on the carpet. Sloan stood in the middle of the dance floor, her champagne glass frozen halfway to her mouth. She looked like she had seen a ghost. I didn't stay in the shadows. I walked right down the center of the room, my boots echoing on the floor. I took the microphone from Franklin's shaking hand. "Good evening, everyone," I said, my voice calm and steady. "I hate to be the one to ruin a good party, but I think there's been a slight misunderstanding about who exactly we're celebrating tonight." I looked directly at Sloan. Her eyes were wide, darting toward the exits. But my security was already there. I explained, for the entire room to hear, exactly who the Whitmores were. I detailed the fraud, the fake identities, and the fact that they were currently under federal investigation. I saw my mother's face crumble in the front row. I saw Garrett's eyes fill with a realization so painful it made him physically flinch. Sloan finally broke. She didn't cry. She hissed. She screamed that I was a liar, that I was just a stinky country girl who couldn't stand to see her brother happy. She lunged at me, her manicured nails like claws, but Wesley's security team was faster. As they led her away, I leaned in and whispered, "The country girl owns the building, Sandra. You're just the trash I'm finally taking out." The ballroom doors swung open, and 4 plainclothes agents walked in. Agent Carla Reeves, the woman who had been hunting the Williams crew for years, stepped forward and clicked the handcuffs onto Franklin's wrists. The elite Whitmores were led out of the Monarch in front of every person they had ever tried to impress. It was the most satisfying thing I had ever seen. The aftermath was a blur of police statements and stunned silence. The guests cleared out, leaving behind half-eaten cake and broken dreams. My mother sat at a table, looking at me like I was a stranger, which, in a way, I was. I showed her the bank records. I told her that the money she thought Garrett had been making was actually mine. I told her that for 4 years, she'd been living on my stinky country money while treating me like an inconvenience. She didn't even have a comeback. She just sat there, clutching Grandma's necklace, which Garrett had snatched back from Sloan the second the handcuffs went on. He walked over to me and placed the necklace in my palm. "This belongs to you," he said, his voice cracking. It always did. We didn't hug. We didn't have a movie moment reconciliation. But for the first time in 30 years, the air between us was clear. 3 weeks later, I was back in my office. Life at the Monarch had returned to its usual high-stakes rhythm. The Whitmores, or the Williams family, were tucked away in a federal holding cell, waiting for a trial that would likely put them away for a very long time. Garrett was starting over, moving back to Millbrook to help our parents navigate the mess. He calls me every Tuesday now. We don't talk about business. We talk about the trees and the quiet. My mother is in therapy, trying to figure out why she spent a lifetime looking past the only person who was actually standing behind her. Rebuilding a family is harder than building a hotel, but I've always liked a challenge. I was finishing up a meeting with some investors when a young woman walked into the lobby. She looked exactly like I did 13 years ago, nervous, wearing cheap clothes that she'd clearly ironed 3 times, and holding a resume like it was a shield. One of my senior partners made a comment about her not fitting the brand. I stood up, walked across the lobby, and shook her hand. I told her my name was Bethany, and I asked her if she knew how to work hard. She nodded, her eyes bright with that same stubborn refusal to fail that I had. I hired her on the spot, because at the end of the day, people will always try to tell you who you are based on where you started. Let them. Desire whispers louder than guilt. And I've learned that the best way to deal with people who look down on you is to make sure they have to look way, way up just to see your shadow. I'm the country girl who owns the room, and I'm just getting started.